Mail-in voting seems to be heavily promoted for the November 2020 elections. Mail-in ballots are the most likely to being altered, stolen or forged, and if criminal activities are suspected, it is the most difficult to prosecute because there is no real hard evidence who did what and whether it was with the intent to defraud. For example, on May 12, 20% of all ballots have been rejected in New Jersey's mail-in election, probably due to fraud, intimidation and theft. In both the 2016 and 2018 elections, more than 16 million ballots were not delivered, leaving those voters with no means to cast a vote. In 2018, more than 1 million ballots that were mailed to voters were returned as undeliverable. Also in 2018, some Southern California counties lost more than 13 million mail-in ballots. In the 2016 general election, millions of mail-in ballots were never counted. According to a report by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, more mail-in ballots were misdirected and unaccounted for than the margin of votes between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Hillary had almost 3 million popular votes more than Donald Trump, yet 6.5 million ballots were misdirected or were unaccounted for. That means for every vote that Hillary won over Trump, more than twice as many mail-in ballots disappeared or went to the wrong address. But large disenfranchisement of voters not only occurs with mail-in ballots. In 2018, in the race for Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, more than 150,000 ballots were just not counted. In Johnson County, Indiana, brand new voting machines failed to detect that many people had voted multiple times. In the 2006 election in Sarasota, Florida, 18,000 votes were deleted from voting machines, which was more than the margin of victory. In the race for Connecticut's governor in 2010, a bag of uncounted votes was discovered after the election. On April 8, 2020, Senator Dan Fayen wrote on his Twitter account, "I learned today that the Wisconsin Election Commission received a call from a postal service worker informing them that 3 large tubs of absentee ballots from Oshkosh and Appleton were just located." What would happen if the postal service has to handle 50 million ballots twice, once they're mailed out to the voters and again when the voters mail them back? Imagine thousands of bags of ballots arriving at a counting station. Each ballot is supposedly verified by comparing the signature with the one on the voter's registration. Let's briefly look at what the steps are that a mail-in ballot must go through. It varies from state to state, but it is not a simple process of vote, mail, and count. Many states require not only the signature of the voter, but also that of a notary public, which costs money, or 2 or 3 witnesses. Many states require a copy of the voter's ID to be included. Other states do not count ballots that show signs of tampering. That's rather brutal, because someone could maliciously just damage the ballots, ensuring that they won't be counted. With all the processes that are required to verify a ballot, physical handling of mail-in ballots is unavoidable. Let's be generous and say that the average time to verify a mail-in ballot, verify the signatures, the affidavits, and the notary public certification takes 1 minute, excluding the work that flows from an invalid ballot. Perhaps it would take much longer, but let's work with 1 minute for now. According to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission's website, more than 140 million Americans voted in the 2016 presidential election, of which 41% were cast before Election Day. That means more than 57 million ballots had to be manually handled. If the average time to verify a ballot is 1 minute, it would take over 957,000 man-hours, or 120,000 days to do, which is 478 years, but who's counting? Some states would have no problem dealing with that workload, but larger states like California sit with the 240,000 man-hour problem if ballots take only 1 minute to process. The reason I am making these estimates is to determine the likelihood that the counting process would be complete by January 20, 2021. It seems unlikely unless a huge effort is engaged well in advance. It is evident that much of what happened in 2000 with the Bush versus Gore debacle will resurface this election. Remember, the Supreme Court never declared a winner in 2000. It merely ruled that the counties should stop recounting, and the candidate who was ahead was declared the winner. The unavoidable delay in declaring a winner due to the workload involved with mail-in ballot counting will at first show President Trump leading, and then mail-in ballots would surface. That would gradually put Joe Biden in the lead when the Supreme Court would rule, stop the counting. If not the Supreme Court, the counting process will drag on beyond January 20, which is the day on which the sitting president will cease to be president, and the Speaker of the House will assume the presidency as acting president. But there's a problem there. The problem is that Nancy Pelosi is also up for re-election and may not be the Speaker at that time, just like 35 senators who are also up for re-election. Who would elect the president, and when? I don't see how this election would not turn into an enormous mess that could shake this nation to its core, or God forbid, destroy it. One tends to forget that it may render the U.S. defenseless without a commander-in-chief. Who knows how the top brass in the military would react? Who knows how our enemies would react? Was this confusion deliberate to prepare us for a total coup d'etat in November? All was made possible because our voting system has not been upgraded in 200 years. There is a solution that will prevent such a crisis and deliver a clear, verifiable election even this close to election day. It won't happen without the support of every American, so stay with me through what I'm about to disclose to you. Just remember, this is not a partisan issue, and the solution also is not partisan. It concerns the entire free world. My name is Nico van Niekerk, and I am the CEO of a U.S. consulting firm that, over the past 50 years, have specialized in solving complex business problems for both large and small financial institutions and other companies. As a naturalized citizen, unlike citizens who were born here, I had to swear an oath of true faith and allegiance to the United States of America, and absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and any fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty. It has left me in a very deep awareness of the treasures of this nation, clearly discernible in its founding. It was a life-changing moment, as it should have been, especially for those of us who had witnessed the destruction of our homelands and countless lives due to socialism and eventually communism. It seems as if we were able to recognize the seeds of totalitarianism in the language of the country's opinion makers much earlier than locals were able to. I started to become aware that there is a weak link in the armor of this nation which threatens its very survival, especially when political language sounds exactly like what precipitated the total destruction of previously free nations. It didn't take long to realize that our election system is one of our weak links. Normally, when I'm commissioned to solve a problem, I start by determining on which foundation the business model rests and where is the company going with that. To put it simply, that approach would, for example, sound the alarm if bank robbers were asked to count a bank's money. To assess the premise of the election process, I looked at the Declaration of Independence, because therein lies the roots of how this nation not only severed its ties with its sovereign, the King of England, but on what grounds did it replace the role of a sovereign in the United States? I found the answer in the Declaration of Independence, where it states that Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, which is you and I, the people. I was surprised at the brilliance and gravity of this simple sentence, and yet it proved that today we are indeed asking bank robbers to take charge of the bank's cash, if you understand what I'm saying. The relationship between the government and the governed, the people, is exclusively by the people's consent, which is expressed through our elections. Whatever elections determine is what the people will believe, almost without question. That leaves elections fatally vulnerable to corruption by those who would want to steer this nation into the clutches of tyranny and totalitarianism with the consent of the people, believing they are doing their patriotic duty. If we momentarily focus on the word consent, a reality comes into view, and that is that no one of inferior rank can give consent to someone of a superior rank. It works the other way around. That means the people of this nation was constituted as the sovereign, replacing the King of England, with government as its emissaries, its servants. To prevent mob rule or a tyrannical government, the Constitution imposes certain laws and restrictions on both the sovereign and its emissaries, the government. This principle of being sovereign yet bound by the law has its foundation in the Magna Carta, which King John of England was forced to sign in 1215, which reigned in the prerogative of perfection of the king. Monarchists fought with all their might against the Magna Carta, and it was reissued in 1216, 1225, and again in 1297, when it finally became part of England's statute law. It took almost a century of brutal civil wars and strife for that principle to settle in British law. All settlers who colonized the Americas knew no other form of government than monarchism. It was only due to their monarch being on the other side of the planet that, quite unintentionally, and at first unbeknownst to them, a totally foreign new culture began to emerge within them. It was separate and hostile to their inherited totalitarian culture. During more than 150 years of living outside the direct influence of the King of England, the settlers' loyalties shifted from totalitarianism to something that had never been seen before, something I refer to as Americanism, or a reflection of the founding principles. Revolution against the King of England was unavoidable, and the Revolutionary War lasted from April 19, 1775 till September 3, 1783, which finally severed the ties with the king, and the people of the United States became an independent nation. But not all Americans were prepared to sever their loyalties to the king. They remained monarchists, and as citizens of the United States of America, they worked hard to carve out a space in society for aristocrats, elite people, even if they are only moral descendants of the King of England. One of the principles of the US Constitution is that all men are created equal, which is a direct assault on any totalitarian thought, including their monarch and their desires to elevate some above others. But one cannot be a king without subjects, or have an aristocracy without a worker class. That is why this nation's history is covered with terrible acts of injustice and violence against some Americans who, according to them, are worthy of nothing more than being obedient and subservient to the aristocracy. But if the aristocracy can be prevented from carving out a niche for special people like them, and the principle that all men are created equal maintained, such a deadly division cannot take root. They knew that they couldn't do it by violence. It has to be by deception, making the American people believe surrendering to totalitarianism is in the interest of the nation. They were hunting for that one crucial vulnerability, and they discovered that elections were archaic and can easily be manipulated. And they were right. If they, in the past, could make the people's consent speak the words of an aristocracy, that would have been the end of these United States. But they couldn't. They instead overtook the education system to teach children and students that the United States is evil and should be abolished, hoping to harvest that crop in the coming generations. They overtook the public media, hoping that their constant bombardment of anti-American rhetoric would eventually steer people through a guilt complex towards totalitarianism. That crop is now ready to be harvested. Whether the coronavirus was a planned event or a windfall to launch the campaign to finally destroy this nation's liberties is irrelevant. The pandemic lockdowns and brutal propaganda gave them a firm grip around the throat of this republic. That is why the assault on our election system is as fierce as it has ever been. That is why I created VoteCounter.com, which will give Americans the opportunity to vote in the government's elections, but also vote in VoteCounter.com, so that there is a verifiable vote count against which the government's vote counts can be measured. VoteCounter.com allows for voter registration that is about 2 or 3 clicks on the voter's computer or device. Vote on the ballots that the government compiled and give voters permanent access to their voting history, even in previous elections. Every vote in VoteCounter.com can be verified and forensically traced to the voter, establishing a record that all the ballots have been cast by legally registered voters, every single ballot. The purpose is not an attempt to replace the government's elections, but to be an independent testimony, an independent standard of the election against which the government's numbers can be compared for accuracy. At the end of Election Day, VoteCounter.com will, within 48 hours, publish its findings on the outcome of the election, whether the government has finished counting their ballots or not. There are material differences between our outcome and that of the government. We can have a court of law establish which numbers are the accepted outcome of the election. Our numbers can be forensically proven. Theirs cannot. Although the design of VoteCounter.com is complete and parts of the underlying process is built, the system needs to be completed in record time so that it is ready by November 3rd, which is why we created a crowdfunding campaign to raise the $250,000 necessary to activate my team of developers to crank this out in 2 weeks. Your immediate contribution is of the highest priority, and as a reward, we will record your name in a First Responders Hall of Fame, honoring your foresight to respond when your country was in need. Contribute now. The entire free world is in your hands. If America is reduced to rubble, there is nowhere else to flee. America needs you.